Welcome to episode number 18 of Stories and Sips, the final episode from my whiskey trip to Ireland late last year, and indeed the first video of 2019. I'm especially excited to bring this episode to you because for me it shares what was probably the highlight of 2018. And if you haven't already guessed from the backdrop here or the lovely drop of Irish brown water that I've got beside me, we're going to Midleton in County Cork for a very special behind the scenes episode. So grab your passport, pack your bags, we're off. I'm Barry Chandler, a proud Irishman in the United States, tempting the locals away from bourbon so they may taste a real whiskey. And I am, of course, referring to Irish whiskey. 2018 was the year Stories and Sips was born, just 16 short weeks ago, and I'm thrilled with the feedback so far. I want to thank everybody for their support and feedback and ideas that they've shared. My plans for 2019 are to do even more to bring attention to the incredible whiskies and the people of Ireland through this channel and in some other ways that I've got planned too. There'll be a new episode every Thursday, and if you haven't already subscribed, then you can do so on YouTube or indeed on storiesandsips.com. And a public service announcement: if you listen to Stories and Sips as an audio podcast only, you may be surprised to learn that you're missing out on the videos that accompany each episode, or you've decided that you don't want to stare at this face as you get your Irish whiskey updates. But in any case, a listener recently shared their surprise at discovering the YouTube channel, so I want to make sure you're aware that this isn't just an audio production, it happens to be a video production. Not a very elaborate video production, but video nonetheless. So back to this week's episode. On a cold morning in late November last year, I found myself at the mecca of Irish whiskey production. I'm speaking, of course, about the Midleton distillery. Perhaps the most important whiskey site in Ireland in terms of historical significance, and indeed the relatively inconspicuous home of production of the world's best-selling Irish whiskey, Jameson. At a recent whiskey tasting, I was asked by a very nervous-sounding American woman if we weren't all concerned in Ireland about the danger of having so much Irish whiskey production in just one place. What, she asked, if there's a natural disaster? Well, it's a while since we've had an earthquake of any size worth reporting on in Ireland, and short of a plague of locusts, I'd say natural disasters are pretty low on the list of perceived threats at Midleton. Nonetheless, today, more Irish whiskey does indeed come out of this one single site in Ireland than all other Irish distilleries combined. And while those ratios are ever changing, it's going to be a while before production at any other distillery could come even close. Midleton has been home to distillation since 1825, when three Murphy brothers purchased and converted an old military barracks and stables into a distillery to take advantage of the Excise Act of 1823, which made distilling far more attractive due to a drop in duty rates. Incidentally, you might be familiar with another enterprise that a younger member of the Murphy family created, Cork's stout of choice, Murphy's Irish Stout. But that's for another episode. The Murphys invested heavily in the distillery, with incredible feats of engineering, including the building of the iron water wheel, which you can see here still turning, and the installation of the largest pot still in the world. It was a record at the time, and it's a record which still stands today. In the 1860s, the Murphys led the amalgamation of a number of Cork distilleries to form the imaginatively named Cork Distilleries Company, eventually consolidating all production of the distilleries in Midleton. That Midleton became the epicentre for Cork whisky production in the 1860s is only made more remarkable by the ironic fact that exactly 100 years later, it was in Midleton that all production of Irish whisky would be consolidated through the amalgamation and the merger of Jameson, Powers and the Cork Distilleries Company. Almost every distillery except Bushmills at the time. And what that did was that it really solidified the little market town in East Cork, just 13 miles east of Cork City, as the centre of the Irish whiskey world. Now, it was this latter consolidation and merger of companies forming a company called Irish Distillers, no one will ever wonder what that company does, will they? That led to the expansion at Midleton and the creation of an entirely new distillery, also imaginatively named the new Midleton Distillery, to cope with the increased production that this merger brought. But here we are today in the old Midleton Distillery, which was opened as the Jameson Experience in 1992, and it's really an incredible time capsule and tour of what is an iconic whisky site. Now you can tour the site, what is about 15 acres of property of this old Midleton Distillery, and you can see how whisky was made, where the barley was dried, where distillation took place, where barrels were stored, and you can just picture the strength needed to haul bags of barley across these vast floors here. And the innovation, you can imagine, used to constantly modernize production as new technologies came online. And for me, there's no better place to have a drink at 9 o'clock in the morning than in one of the old barrel warehouses, especially if that drink happens to be a drop of Redbreast 12 that was distilled a couple hundred feet away, and you're drinking it right next to Master Cooper Ger Buckley's cooperage, where another drop of whiskey awaits you on your early morning tour, but certainly something to get rid of the chill. And in Ger Buckley's office, as it were, and his cooperage, I got to taste a lovely little drop of Cooper's Crows, one of the Maker series at Middleton, and this was Ger's own expression of what he believes is the finest expression of Irish whiskey. And influenced by the 200-odd years of distilling and innovation on the site, a micro distillery was opened on the grounds of the old Midleton Distillery in 2015 for the purposes of experimentation outside of the regular production lines, which are running at full capacity. And it's this micro distillery that has given us the really experimental and fascinating Method and Madness range of Irish whiskies. And many of them have been informed by old recipes like those found in ledgers and documents from years gone by. And it's here that new graduates and apprentices are paired with the masters of distillation, the master of blending and maturation, to combine the wise old ways and the innovative methods and fresh perspectives that could only come from youth. And I can't help but think that with this constant evolution of Middleton since 1825, this pairing of old and new just doesn't seem to be too out of line with how Middleton has always operated. Here you see micro distiller Henry Donnelly hard at work cleaning out his stills in advance of the next run of the stills for the next batch of Method and Madness. But there's, for me, an incredible sense of stability in Middleton. It's hard to explain it, but the fact that over 200 years of production, the same walls, the same paths, the same buildings are still in use for almost the same reason. I mean, there's a feeling that there's always a succession plan. Master will hand over to apprentice eventually, tours will come and go, brands will grow and shrink, and maybe ownership will change, yet in this little corner of East Cork, whiskey will be made, humbly and consistently. It's reassuring. And in Cork, you'd be in trouble for getting too big for your boots. But talking to anyone here, from master to apprentice to tour guide, there's no sense that they're wearing some of the biggest boots in the world. And that's a pretty special thing. Everyone's willing to stop for a chat and have the crack. It's that uniquely Irish of things. It's quite special being here in the old distillery in Middleton. And as a fellow with 1 foot in America and 1 foot in Ireland, it makes me smile, or beam. It probably makes me beam. But if that makes me beam, then the next stop in Middleton is where the smile and that beam wraps completely around my head, because I'm going behind some typically closed doors for a very special tour. This is the Distiller's Cottage, the historic home of whomever was in charge of distilling in Middleton. It's famously where Barry Crockett, Master Distiller Emeritus at Middleton, was born. It's where his father, Master Distiller before him, Max Crockett, lived, and today is home to the Irish Distillers Archive. When you have a history of the Jameson, Powers and Cork Distilleries Company stretching back to 1780, what's to become of that history? Well, luckily for us and future generations, a decision was made by the parent company of Irish Distillers, Pernod Ricard, to collect and organise, preserve and showcase this history in all its forms. So it is that since late 2012, the first professionally qualified archivist to ever work for the company, Carol Quinn, has been leafing through ledgers, organising the shelves of her temperature and humidity controlled archives, and shedding light on the stories and the people that built the Irish whisky industry.
This room is all the records of the Dublin distilleries, and the room next door is Cork, and that's just basically how I divide them, just so that I can get a handle on stuff. So what you're looking at is, these are the records of Bow Street. So when Bow Street was shut down in 1975, along with John's Lane, all these records were in situ. You know, they were in attics, they were in basements, they were all over the place. So the company knew they were important, but didn't know what to do, but didn't want to lose them. So they all got wrapped up, along with the Paris John's Lane material, and there was 40 pallets of material was wrapped up.
Unbeknownst to me, Carol has taken the time to lay out an artefact-rich chronology of Irish whiskey as seen through some of my favourite brands, Jameson and Powers. Here we have the rich history of what was at one time the trusted tipple of kings and emperors around the world, Powers single pot still whiskey. At one time only affordable by the very wealthy. And you can see the beautiful promotional cards that Powers created back when they were in John's Lane in Dublin, which you might remember from my previous episode. And they've created these beautiful cards to promote their famous whiskey from Bombay to Hawaii and everywhere in between. Here we have John Jameson II's diary from 1826, where a few grains of barley were found and analysed and then preserved. We see his recipes, his notes, his records of how much he paid to whom and for what. And these historical treasures look like they were produced yesterday, such is their condition. And here we see some of the contracts between Jameson and their bonders and their bottlers all around the country, including some of the quality control tools, a little bit primitive by today's standards perhaps, but these were used to check the colour of the alcohol in pubs around the country against the colour being produced by the distillery, and they would have been used by inspectors to make sure nobody was watering down the precious drop. And as we move then on to the Jameson Bow Street Distillery wage register, Carol's opened up the records on one particular week, and we can clearly see the record of employees marked as paid the first half of the week, but Thursday and Friday remain blank. It doesn't take long before it dawns on me, and a little pencil note in the top left-hand corner of the page confirms, Rebellion in Dublin, all employees paid the full week. What an incredible piece of history. The distillery right in the middle of the Easter Rising in Dublin, the week that created a nation. You can only imagine what these men saw and witnessed that week. And then there's this iconic contract, the merger agreement that created Irish distillers, the document that legalised the foresight of the leaders of Jameson, Powers and Cork Distilleries Company, who abandoned ego to agree to a merger that saw some of them lose their distilleries. But were it not for this tripartisanship, we might all be drinking scotch today. And who wants to drink scotch? I'm only scratching the surface of what this archive holds, and indeed what Carol shared with me on that great day in the archive. But for me, why this archive is so important, well, it can be really summed up by a speech that Winston Churchill gave to the House of Commons, where he paraphrased George Santayana, and he said, "Those who fail to learn from history are condemned to repeat it." This archive provides more than 200 years of knowledge, of learning, of success and failure. It gives us recipes that worked and those that were an unmitigated disaster. It tells us about the people, what they were thinking, what they faced and what they overcame. All analogous to business and the whiskey industry we have today. So to ignore it would be a travesty. To try and reinvent what's already been invented would be wasteful. And contriving new marketing stories and brand positions will always be inferior to the real and far more interesting stories that already exist. Carol is the guardian of the past and the key to the future. And we're already seeing Jameson ad campaigns draw from the stories in the archive, and the Method and Madness range of whiskies, of course, draws from long forgotten recipes. Long may this collaboration reign between the distillers, the archivists and the marketers. Because as Carol said to me, we don't have to make anything up. The truth is far more interesting. And I think there's a lesson here for all burgeoning distilleries in Ireland and indeed the marketers that work there. But you don't need a 200-year history to craft authentic marketing, and you don't need to be the largest producer of Irish whiskey to tell a meaningful story. So I have lots more to share with you over the coming weeks from my trip to Midleton. It's a Disney World for whiskey lovers. And I can't wait to go back the next time I'm back in Ireland. And I'm really excited for what's going to come out of that distillery in 2019, because I know there are some very special things coming down the pipeline that we're going to be very excited about over the next few months. So a huge thank you to Carol Quinn for being so generous with her time and her knowledge, and for sharing her contagious passion for a history that has given us the industry really that we know today. So to Carol and the Irish Distillers team for inviting me to experience the amazing history of the Irish Distillers Company and brands. Sláinte. If I could only drink one whiskey for the rest of my life, I'd be happy with Middleton. But I think I've said that about Redbreast too, and Powers, and a few others. But in any case, there's no shortage of whiskey. If you liked this episode, and sure why wouldn't you, isn't it about whiskey? Please subscribe so that I can foist my opinions upon you and slowly, subliminally and successfully convert you to the joys of Irish whiskey. You can subscribe to this episode on iTunes, SoundCloud and wherever you get your podcasts by simply searching for Stories and Sips. And of course you can see every episode in full Technicolor by subscribing on YouTube. And if you know a friend who might like Stories and Sips, then be a good friend to them and forward them a link so that they too can be converted to the Irish nectar. Sláinte.